Hi, Cheryl Lynch here for part 2 of how to create the embellished fabric fiber books. Say that 3 times fast. So this is the book I'm going to be sharing with you how I made and all the different techniques. Hopefully you saw episode 1 where I showed all the different books that I made. But today we're going to focus on how to make a page out of a photograph. So this is the page, this is the page we're going to do. This book is about my trip to Holland, and Holland is filled with windmills. Each of these pages measure 6.5 by 8.5 inches unfinished. So to start with, I started with a photograph of one of the windmills. So this is the photograph, and what I did is I took it off my computer and I printed it out about the same size that I needed for a page of my book. So this is about 6.5 by 8.5. Usually I tend to make them a little larger and trim them down, and that just gives it a much better look. So there's the page. So then what I do is I take a piece of tracing paper and I trace out the major points in the photograph. You can't put everything in because it would just be too complicated, especially on this small scale. So you just want to have the feeling of the windmill and some of the detail. So I think what's important was the windmill, the fact that it's on a canal, and the blades of the windmill and the little windows. So that is the basis for my block. When I trace the block onto Fusible Web, you're going to end up flipping it and mirror imaging it. So when I do that, you trace the wrong side of the block onto the Fusible Web. Now here it's a little hard to see my pencil lines. I would either go over them with Sharpie marker or put this on a light box and put the Fusible Web on top of it, paper side up, and trace it. So these are the pieces. Let me get them out. These are the pieces I created from that photo. This is part of the windmill. Here you can see. Let me lay them on here. See, here's part of the windmill. Here's the grass. This is part of the dike. And here's some water. And this is the base of the windmill. And it's important when you lay these down that you have them in the order that you want to stitch. And I think the best order is the closest the pieces should be on top. So you put the furthest pieces on first. So the furthest thing would be the windmill, the base of the windmill, and then the windmill and its sides. And here's a little cap. And don't forget to peel off the paper from your Fusible Web before you fuse it down. And what I would do, well, first, before we get there, I'm getting ahead of myself, is I like to quilt my background. I pre-quilt my background before I start adding the applique. And that just helps you in terms of having to quilt around the applique, which becomes complicated sometimes. So let me move this to the side. I take a piece of batting. So this batting is larger than 6.5 by 8.5. It's larger than my block. And in this case, I'm going to take my sky fabric, lay it on here, and I'm going to quilt it. And what the nice thing is that it's a little piece, so it's easy to quilt. So this is what it looks like. Now, notice I have nothing on my back. There's no fabric on my back. There's only going to be fabric on my back once I put the books together, because I don't want all the messiness of my quilting and embellishing and knots and everything to show. So lay that on there, pre-quilt the background. So after the background is quilted, then you can start laying on the pieces in the order in which you're going to stitch them. So if you look here, that's the base of the windmill. That is going to be behind the windmill. So I would fuse that on, add the windmill, the sides and the sides, and the sides, So I would stitch around that. I like to use a blanket stitch, and then I would put on the cap, and then I would move down to the grass. This is what I would use for the wood that's holding back the canal, and then the canal. So all my stitching, I would stitch all those down in that order. And then after that was done, I probably do a little quilting in the water, or I did a little quilting in the water, and I hand drew in the blades of the windmill. And I stitched those over the blue marker that I used with a satin stitch and a straight stitch, and add a little button. Now the one thing I did that, actually I did this for the first time, and that's the fun of making these blocks. The fun is that you continually get new challenges. So the challenge for this is I didn't want to add those little teeny tiny windows out of fabric. So I used some fabric paint, and I used some masking tape and a little bit of yellow paint, and with a Q-tip, so I masked off a little rectangle area, and with a Q-tip, I dabbed, and put in the windows. I removed the tape, and then with a fine point Sharpie marker, I just put in the grids to the window. So that is how I did my windmill block, and I leave them the full size, and then I trim them down right before I'm ready to turn them into one of the book pages. And that's the page.